Got my Pride Bud Light t-shirt on because I'm a real St. Louis girl. Hi, welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. My name is Sunny, and today I'm bringing to you my August wrap-up. So in August, I read around 26 books, which may sound impressive, but it's a little bit, the stats I think are a little off because each comic is like 25 pages. If they haven't been compiled into a volume or a graphic novel yet, that's like considered one book on Goodreads or whatever. And also I'm counting one book that I started at the very end of August, but technically like finished in early September because I finished at like midnight or something. But anyways, that's the situation. And as usual, I'm going to be going through my reads from what I read first in the month to what I read last. I also want to give the disclaimer that I totally failed my August TBR, which is quite typical for me, as I did preface in my TBR video, but you know, we move, and I did get to quite a few books this month, even if I still am like a dozen books behind my Goodreads reading challenge goal for the year, so we don't even know where the fuck that's heading right now. But alas, let's just get into the fucking books. The first book I read in the month of August was Female Husbands, A Trans History by Jen Mannion. This book is a nonfiction sort of compilation of accounts of European and American female husbands across like the 19th-ish century usually, and female husband is the term that a lot of the newspapers and accounts of these people were, but the author of this book refers to these people as with like they them pronouns essentially, because we in a contemporary lens have no real way of knowing like were they just like lesbian butch women who had to assimilate into heteronormative society as men in order to be able to marry their wives, or were they trans men, or you know, like we really have no way of being able to impose our current identity label markers onto the past, I guess. But this book was a really interesting recollection of the history of like the lesbian trans masculine continuum, I guess, that I learned a lot from and I thought was so interesting. And I really did enjoy this, so I would definitely recommend it. I think I rated it like 4 stars, but you know, it's nonfiction. I think it's also written in a pretty conversational tone. It's pretty easy to read, and the author uses the I voice pretty frequently, and there's a lot of primary source documents and just excerpts of newspaper clippings and legal documents and quotes and such that were pretty fascinating to read, of the different ways that legal and social frameworks and institutions approached the reality of essentially like people who were assigned female at birth being perceived and operating throughout the world as men in one way or the other, particularly in how they were married to women. So it was a pretty interesting nonfiction book, and you should definitely check it out if like lesbian and queer and trans history interests you. Oh, and I think it was published this year too. So the next book I read was another nonfiction, but this time it was a memoir, and that is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy, which has been a very hyped book over this past month. It's caused a lot of discourse, but I think it's warranted because I really did enjoy this. I think I rated it like 4.5 stars simply because there were some elements of the writing that I found a little bit simplistic for the nature of the really harrowing story that I was telling. I also recommended it at the end of a podcast episode kind of recently in the third and last segment of the podcast, because our first segment is like hot takes that listeners submit. Second segment is discussing a piece of media or a movie, a book, whatever that we consume together that week and discuss, and then the last segment is us recommending media. I recommended this book because I do think that it is a very compelling read that anyone who's interested in pop culture or like Hollywood and the production of what we see on screen should definitely check out. And I think it really humanizes the horrifying reality that a lot of the child stars that we see are subjected to. Jennette McCurdy's story of living in like poverty essentially with her family and her mom pushing her into an acting career she never really wanted, and being super reliant and dependent and loving her mom so much from a very young age, and only coming to terms with the abuse that her mom was doing onto her when she's an adult was so difficult to read. And it was structured very well, I think, and the way that the writing shifted from a childlike perspective to a more adult one was quite compelling and interesting. And I thought that this was pretty good. And I also do think it's sad that people are using this book to create trauma porn-ish content about, because it is ultimately a very vulnerable and heart-wrenching story about a woman who's undergone a lot of traumatic experiences in her family life, in just her interpersonal relationships, in her relationship to the public, in her career, with her own body, and her eating disorder that her mom impressed onto her. It was in many ways very relatable to me, and it made me cry at some points. I listened to the audiobook version through the Libro FM influencer program, so thank you so much to the Libro FM program for providing the book to me for free. And the audiobook was phenomenal because Jennette McCurdy herself reads it, obviously. And there's one point in the book where you can hear her tearing up, and it was just really, it was really sad, but still a pretty brilliant book, I would say. So I would definitely pick it up if you can stomach the many trigger warnings that it entails. But yeah, I'm glad the buzz around it has been more positively received, I guess. But anyways, I talk more about it on the podcast episode towards the end if you want to go check that out. The next book that I read in the month of August was for Women in Translation Month, so I did get a book off my TBR, and that is Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. I rated this book 4 stars. It is a very small book, like a novella, I would say, and it's written in 2 parts. The first half is from the third person perspective of an Israeli soldier in like 1948 or something like that, basically during one of the first major massacres, or one of like the Nakba, I'm pretty sure, and the account of him leading these troops and finding this Bedouin girl and the horrifying things they subject her to. But that sort of then leads into a modern day, or like a 2017 timeline, in which this woman in the first person point of view perspective becomes really obsessed with, or really interested into looking more into the details of this specific case of this Bedouin girl being raped and murdered by these soldiers. We follow her on like essentially like a 48-hour journey across different checkpoints and areas of like A, B, and C across occupied Palestine in trying to find out more information. And I think that the book title is pretty aptly named because it is very much focused on the minor details of something that has affected millions of people and has spanned, of course, more than half of a century of trauma and terror and alienation and struggle. It was very compelling. How I star rate my books are like 5-star books, or books that like I know they just have a 5-star like vibe to me. It's not that they are perfect books or that like I would recommend them to everyone, but that they are perfect to me. Like I love them so much and they will live as a part of me and my brain and my soul forever. 4-star books are books that I'm like, these are really good and I would recommend them to a lot of people, but I don't know. I read so many books, not all of them can be such a big part of me, I guess. But this book was very good. I wouldn't say that it's 5 stars, not for any particular reason, but yeah, it was really compelling, and I listened to it on Hoopla, which is an audiobook app that's free. You should check it out. And I not enjoyed because it's a really sad and horrifying and traumatic story, but it was a good audiobook that I would recommend. Very short, 2 hours or something. The contrast of the two different but related timelines and perspectives was definitely really powerful, but again, like, pretty deeply triggering. And because obviously I read this for Women in Translation Month, this was translated from the original text, which was written in Arabic. This came to be on my TBR because I listened to this podcast called The Bookstore, ran by Becca and Corinne. I've been listening to it for years now. I think I started listening to it towards the beginning of the pandemic, which was like fucking over 2 years ago at this point, which is crazy. But anyways, they had an episode on this, which I listened to, and I did enjoy their thoughts on it. So if you want more thoughts on this book, go listen to that episode, because like, I would recommend it. But I would also recommend you read this book. Like, I would very much highly recommend it. The next book that I read was another book off of my Women in Translation Month TBR. So again, not totally unsuccessful, but like, I still failed in general with the TBR. But this book was Flowers of Mold. I keep on saying Flowers and Mold, but it's Flowers of Mold by seong-nan. This is a short story collection of kind of surreal, dark stories, but they're more realism than not. And this was kind of underwhelming for me. None of those short stories really stand out in my mind, but I still generally enjoyed my time with it. I rated it 3 stars because I don't have any real criticisms of it, but I also don't have any real points of like things that I really loved about it, I guess. I feel pretty neutral towards it. I think I would recommend it to anyone who enjoys a sort of detached short story collection writing style, I guess. And typically I do. I just think that these short stories, some of them were just not that compelling for me. I did enjoy the one about the gymnast who, over the course of the story, can no longer be a gymnast. There was an interesting one about these different tenants and a landlord that ended on a weird note. I just think it was strange and unsettling in some ways, and somewhat fever dream-ish, like, but also, again, like, more grounded in reality than the more fantastical short story collections that I typically read. So I guess maybe that also colored my expectations going into it, because I didn't expect it to be as not crazy as it was, I guess. But I did enjoy it, and it wasn't like a failed read for me. It wasn't like a new favorite or anything. So yeah, 3 stars. The next book that I read was another Women in Translation Month book, but it wasn't on my TBR. It just counts because it is a book written by a woman that was translated from another language. Oh, also, this book was translated from the Korean, if you didn't know. The next book that I read was There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job by Kikuko Tsumura. This book follows from, I think, the first person point of view, this woman who is burnt out from her previous job, so goes to this like employee agency, takes on a series of strange but meaningless jobs. She starts off at a job that is just her surveilling through these hidden cameras a writer like 24/7. And then she moves on to other weird jobs that involve just like strange but consistent routines. And at each one, something happens that makes her be like, I'm gonna move on to a different thing. And I thought it was very interesting and well-paced and compelling for a book that is just about a woman taking on these trivial jobs and the minute day-to-day tasks of interacting with her coworkers and all of this. I think it was kind of like a dry sitcom almost, but like not that funny, I guess, but not that dramatic either. You know, there are some moments of drama, but it's not a standout. I also went into this book with pretty low expectations. Like, I know I had gotten some hype, but I wasn't really expecting much from it, because this is written by a Japanese author, by the way, so it was translated from the Japanese, and I've noticed that a lot of the Japanese translated novels that I've read have usually been like really hyped, and I haven't really fucked with them as much as everyone else has seemed to, and this seemed to be in that same like vein. But I actually did really enjoy this in a way that I was not really expecting to. And also, I was weeding the flower beds while I was listening to the audiobook of this book, and it was kind of hilarious doing the minute, repetitive detail for hours on end of plucking the same tiny weeds out of the soil over and over again while listening to this woman talk about the repetitive tasks and things that she was expected to do for her job. It was just a moment of irony for me, I would say. But yeah, I really did enjoy this, but I do think that it's not that memorable for me. It was one of those books that while I was reading it, while I was listening to it, I was like, I fuck with this, I want to finish this. But when I was done with it, I thought about it for maybe like a day, but now it's sort of going to fade into my memory more so in a way that I think some of the other books on this list are just going to be way more memorable for me, I guess. But this is definitely a book I would recommend if this sort of like literary fiction following a sort of morose and detached, floating around young woman is your kind of thing, then you should check it out, because I think I rated it like 3.5 stars. All right, the next book that I read was actually a thriller, and that is The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager. And I actually really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars, which is kind of like really impressive for me, because I feel like I rarely give like mystery thriller type books that high of ratings. Maybe that's a generalization that isn't true, but that's just how I feel. But I really like this, and I think a lot of people have like mixed feelings about it, and I get why, but also like, I don't know, I think it's kind of absurd enough for me to get behind while still being dark in a way that makes it actually like a thriller. Basically, if you don't know the premise already, also I've read a couple other Riley Sagers, but not all of his books at all, and I think all of his books, well, from what I've read, a lot of his books seem to have like a strange sort of almost supernatural element to it that I find kind of fun and campy, I guess. This book is about a woman who is an alcoholic, and her husband just died, and she's living at this house that her family owns that is on a like remote lake, and she has a few neighbors at these different houses, but there's only like 5 houses at the lake, so she always knows who is at the lake at any given time. Shady shit is happening in the house across the lake, because it is entirely like glass she can see through, and she can see the couple and the shit that's going down. And something not right is happening. And there were a couple just like twists throughout the very like last third or quarter of the novel that I was like, whoa. And I think the build up to it was also pretty solid. Like, we got enough background and formation of our main character's perspective and her unreliable narration situation going on that I found pretty compelling. And honestly, I think Riley Sager does that a lot. I think his previous book, and the other book that I also really did enjoy from him, was Survive the Night, in which our main character has this post-traumatic effect in which she falls asleep at random instances. So because our main character here is an alcoholic, her memory and experiences with the world can sometimes be blurry. And yeah, it's very interesting because like all of her neighbors and all of the people who care about her and who she's just met, or, you know, whatever, like they could have any intents, you know, like it's one of those types of things, which I think a lot of thrillers are about. It's like you don't really know what's happening with the other people. If you're down for a slow build up to some crazy shit with a touch of the weird, bizarre, creepy, supernatural, but not too much, you should check this out. And also, our main character is an actress. Her mother is a big Broadway star. That is also a really key element to this book, I would say. But yeah, I did really like this, and I like the cover too. So I'm glad I got a hardcover edition of this, even though I typically you know, I think I wanted to add to my like collection of mysteries because I don't really have that many mystery thrillers, I guess. So I'm glad I have this one here because I don't necessarily want to own all of Riley Sager's books, but I did like this one. So the next book that I read was the first volume of a comic series called The Avant-Guards by Carly Usdin, I think. And this is about a college queer girl friend group, a basketball team, and we're just following these two main characters, these girls who are, one of them is like trying to form a team and the other one is a more like reticent, reserved, like a loner type. And it was cute, it was sweet. I don't have that many complaints. I rated it 4 stars. I don't think there's much to say about it. I thought it was a sweet sapphic book. It's fun, you know, it's sweet, and I'm excited to see where volume 2 goes, if and when I pick it up. And I'm glad to get more comic books and graphic novels under my belt for this year because I do really enjoy them. And I think I read this on Scribd, like ebook style, on my iPad, which is like, that's just, that is the perfect setup for me. I guess. Second best to like physically reading a comic book or graphic novel, I guess. Anyways, I really enjoyed this and I would recommend it if that sounds up your alley. The next book that I read was Lapvona by Ottessa moshfegh. Highly anticipated read, and I talked about this book in my unhaul a little bit. Not really. I was unhauling my other copy because I got a signed copy and I was hunting all over to find one, and I finally did at one of my local indies. But this book, wow, I really enjoyed it. I rated it 4 stars because I don't think it's like a new favorite or all-time favorite or even favorite of the year, but I did really like it because, like all moshfegh books, we're following characters who are despicable, characters who do strange things in a strange world. This time it's in a fictional medieval world where gross and bizarre things that involve God and a false god at that. False God by Taylor Swift. Anyway, it's very bizarre, but not like unexpected, you know? I think I really do enjoy this type of setting for like historical fiction, and the vagueness but specificity, like the continuum that this setting and book and the characters like lives on, is the type of shit that I really enjoy in a medieval setting, I guess. All of our characters were, of course, like I said, like totally despicable, but that's what's fun about them and like about reading about them and what they think and why they do what they do and their simplistic drives for and motivations for like what drives their behaviors and actions. Lapvona was a solid read. I rated it 4 stars. I thought it was kind of funny at times because of the satirical nature of how it was interrogating religion in this particular time period, and also the way that the different characters treated each other in terms of like biological family relations, and also if and why and how they even liked or disliked each other. So yeah, I liked it. And I would recommend it if you like strange, weird shit, or Ottessa moshfegh and her writing. Oh, also the audiobook was narrated by her, which was like, that was crazy. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed listening to her read her own, like, gross, horrific descriptions of shit and blood and food. The next book that I read was The Angel of Rome by Jess Walter, which is a short story collection that I fucking adored. I loved this short story collection so much. I rated it 5 stars. The title short story is phenomenal. I mean, it's a short story collection. I feel like I don't want to give any of the stories away, but a lot of them deal with the theme of like family and aging and finding yourself and like taking care of other people, or just like, you know, real human things. It's all realistic fiction. A lot of it is like set in the past or the present, and the titular short story is about this young man goes to Rome on a fucking penny under a guise of some sorts and gets roped into a movie set on accident, and his life unfolds from there. I think this book was simultaneously grand and focused on the little details, and there were some elements of like magic or absurdism, but not a lot. And there was a lot of focus, I think, on like there are some stories that really focused on like illness and the deterioration of your body and mind that comes with like aging, and again like parent-child relationships often. But honestly, like when I was reading this, I didn't know whether Jess Walter was a man or a woman or anything else, and I only found out halfway through the book when I was like trying to look more into who the author was, and he's a man and ostensibly straight and like has children and he's white and whatever. But I was like, I don't know, he was able to tell particularly like the stories of women with like this tender like care almost, and particularly also like the intricacies of women's relationships with men, but also like men's perspectives on their relationships with women in a way that I was like, this is really intriguing and smart and heartwarming. And Jess Walter also seems to be a very prolific writer and has written a bunch, but this is the first thing of his that I've read, and I just feel like I don't read that many like white American men writing in English, you know, generally speaking. But this was so good. And I don't know if any of his other books interest me, but I really enjoyed this short story collection so much. And I think I'll talk about it in a future video where I talk about like literary short story collections that I really enjoy, and I'll go more into detail there after I revisit I have my little stack over there are other collections I want to talk about, but after I've revisited them all and pointed out the things that I enjoy, I'll also talk about this one, of course. The next book that I read was We Had to Remove This Post by Hanna Bervoets. I think this was originally written in Dutch, and it's about this woman who worked as a content moderator at a social media company, and she frames it as like a letter to this lawyer who's working on a lawsuit against said company for the working conditions that the workers were subjected to. And I really enjoyed this. Of course, it's a very short book. I rated it 4 stars, but I did think it was quite smart, but like it faced a lot of the surface level things that we deal with on the internet in the day-to-day, and the surface level like violence and rhetoric that is present every day on a level that like is surface level to me, that surface level content, I guess. The writing wasn't necessarily anything like spectacular, but I understand why some people think it was like gratuitous. But the thing is that like the nature of internet violence is that it is gratuitous, and the nature of the content that is posted on there that these moderators are moderating, you know, it is that. The content itself was affecting our main character's relationship to her girlfriend, because she meets this woman at the company who she ends up dating, and then she like breaks up with her over the course. We see that the fall of that relationship in this. And also what's interesting about our main character is that she doesn't want to be involved in the lawsuit, and this book, in the letter that she's writing to the lawyer, is sort of, I guess, like explaining why, or like her story. And it was also interesting to see like how the nature of their workplace and the work they did affected how the employees interacted with each other, and like the things that they believed, and how the things that they consumed like informed their identities and like, eroded at their own like empathy and numbed them to the world. Like, it was interesting to see the arbitrary rules that they had to follow in trying to see how to moderate content and what stuff drew them in. I don't know. I thought it was really interesting. I rated it 4 stars. This wasn't on my Women in Translation month TBR, but it is a Woman in Translation book, so that's good, I guess. Fits the theme. So yeah, I would recommend this if you have the stomach for it. The next book that I read was A Crooked Tree by Una Mannion. This book I rated 3 stars because it's somewhat unmemorable, because even now, despite me having read this like just a few weeks ago, I don't really remember that much about it. Although I do say that it was quite compelling when I was reading it. It's about this tight-knit family that's in this more isolated small town in like rural Appalachian like America, I think. And essentially in this dysfunctional family, it's a single mom household, and the mom is pretty lax in some ways, and one of the daughters gets left at the side of the road in the middle of the night, essentially, in the middle while they're having a fight in the car, and that's what starts this like chain of events that unfolds because violence happens inevitably, and the social dynamics of the town and their family are inevitably affected. And we're following all of this through the perspective of the older daughter, who is our main character, and the way that she's trying to control like all the different relationships in her life and like maintain the balance of peace in her household and in her town. I think it was quite compelling as a narrative, but I don't necessarily think it was too memorable or bringing that much new to the table. I don't know. Like, I think that the story of this family in poverty and the complexities and the social implications of like the affairs that the adults have and the perspectives that the children have on that, and these relationships, the grief of losing a parent and the aftermath of that, and close friendships that are inevitably really put through the fire due to the traumatic events that children face. It was quite emotionally compelling, but again, like, this isn't a book that I could off the bat recommend or remember. I think I kind of had to jog my memory about this anyways. But yeah, I did enjoy it, but it's not a standout, which is why it is a 3-star read for me. The next book that I read was A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers. Oh my god. Guys, 5 fucking stars, of course. A Psalm for the Wild was one of my favorites of last year, and this book is definitely, I think, one of my favorites of this year as well. I didn't know what to expect for the sequel, but this gave me everything and more of what I wanted. We're following the tea monk and the robot, still, of course, and they are on a tour of like Pangea, essentially, where the robot named Moshfegh is meeting with humankind for the first time in centuries and interacting with humans and finding out what they want and what they need, and it's just so beautiful. It's so beautiful. Both of these characters go through journeys of self-exploration that were heart-wrenching, and the world that we see and that gets more fleshed out and explored, and the technology and the social world building, it becomes more fleshed out in a way that felt so meaningful and real that I was like, wow, I love this so much. You need to pick this up. You need to pick up this series. It's phenomenal. This novella, sci-fi, fantasy, heartwarming shit just gets me every fucking time, dude. Like, it's about humanity, it's about eco-feminism and eco-futurism, a post-capitalist, post-class society, post-technology future that isn't even post-technology. Like, it's just so brilliant and very queer and so adorable, but also brilliant. I just have so much love in my heart for this series. So yeah, I fucking adored this. The next book that I read was the first comic in the comic series Ma, which is a feminist horror comic series, graphic novel thing, and I enjoyed it. I read 1, 2, 3, and 4, so I would count that as 4 books, but I'm just gonna talk about all 4 of them now. I would rate them all like 4 stars. I think that the art was fucking stunning, and the way that it visually manifests like male violence and also female retaliation against it, and feminism and the feminist movement through like this trauma release ceremony, women's retreat in this remote area, was really fascinating because it takes on those tropes of like a feminist old lesbian leader and like a cultish like group, but takes these twists with like the typical rape survivor trauma story and narrative in ways that involves like body horror and monstrousness that and like nature that I enjoyed, and I'm interested in seeing where the rest of the series goes. So yeah, pick it up if trigger warnings about rape and gore and seeing that type of like drawn out shit. Well, not rape itself, but themes of like sexual violence and gendered violence as explored through the visual medium of like comics and graphic novels. If that triggers you, don't pick it up, but I think otherwise, if the feminist themes of horror is something that you enjoy, you should check out this comic series. The next book that I read was Smile and Look Pretty, which I rated 4.5 stars. Although now that I'm thinking about it, I would more rate it 4 stars. Let me change my Goodreads rating now, actually. I'm bad about this because I love to rate book something and then be like, actually no, and change my mind. But we all have flaws, right? This book is following these 4 best friends, these women who live and work in New York City and are assistants to these high-powered professionals in their industries of choice, whether that be acting or like TV writing or book publishing, stuff like that. And it's about them essentially coming together, being sick of the shit they have to put up with, and creating a website for anonymous submissions of people's stories about their own working conditions. And it sort of starts this like underground revolution kind of. I thought it was like a millennial girl boss type story that was actually quite compelling and interesting, that captured my attention and my emotions and explored like the nuances of workplace sexual harassment in a way that was very in tune with like the 21st century and the nature of like social media and the internet and cell phones, and how young women relate to each other and how much fervor and passion people have for their careers of choice, and how industries exploit that for all that it's worth, and how patriarchy and misogyny is so fucking egregious in even the most minute ways in these male-dominated industries and workplaces. That was pretty interesting for me to read about these badass, hardworking, passionate women who had high hopes for the industries but feel stuck in a rut due to the powers that be and the men around them, like preventing them from being able to do what they really want to do, and them trying to take action against that, but also not wanting to be blacklisted from their industries for doing so. And that's like very real, right? So yeah, I would recommend this for sure. I've been doing this thing where I go on like reading streaks where I'm like, I read one book and then I'm like, wow, I really like that. Let me go read every other book that feels like this in some way or the other. And it made me do a video about money and female characters and like wealth accumulation, and how interrogation of like industries and careers and scamming all intersects in like a multimedia examination thing. I made a video about it. Anyways, the next book that I read in the month of August was Fake by Erica Katz. This book follows a young female main character, once again in New York City, and she is once again the like underdog to a giant prestigious industry, this time being art and art galleries. She is a replicator painter at this like legitimate art replicator studio and company, in which in order for like museums and galleries to be able to take the original masterpieces down, to clean them and restore them and put them back up on display, they need to have like exact copies of them on display for the museum goers to go see. So here comes our main character in this book. I think her name's Emma or something. And her peers and her fellow employees at this company called Gemini that make these copies, these forgeries that aren't like forgeries for real because they signed them with their own names on the back and it's like legit and legal and like sanctioned. But basically our main character gets swept up by this Russian billionaire and gets her dream job as a gallery assistant director. She is like a somewhat failed artist, even though she wanted to get into the art industry as an artist. And it's about her like getting involved in this glamorous art world and becoming friends with this social media art influencer that she's obsessed with. But things go south quickly, and we see stuff not adding up as she goes through this glamorous world of trying to keep up with everything around her. And it was really interesting. It was an interesting examination of like the art world from inside of it, and like how rich people live and social media's effects on all of this stuff. I really liked it. I thought it was so fast-paced and compelling, and I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. I was like, oh, what's gonna happen next? I did think our main character was sometimes a little frustrating, and a lot of the characters were a little bit two-dimensional, but I think like that's kind of the nature of a book like this, I guess. But anyways, yeah, I rated this book 4 stars. I would definitely recommend it, especially for anyone who's interested in the art world and the art scene in general. I think this provided a lot of insight into it, which it's a fictional book, so I don't know how legit it is, but like it was really interesting. Next up, I read Counterfeit by Kirsten Chen. I actually listened to the audiobook of this through Libro FM's ALC program once again, so thank you to Libro FM for that. This book was also so fucking good. I rated it 4.5 stars, maybe 5 stars. I am still thinking about this book, so it's, I don't know, I'm still obsessed with it. It is about this Chinese American working professional woman who was like a high-powered corporate tax lawyer, but then stopped being one to help raise her child. And then she's sort of restless and unhappy. Her old friend from college, Winnie, comes in and is like, hey, I run this scheme selling counterfeit purses. Here's the fucking deal. And she gets roped into the Chinese super fake handbag market, essentially. But the book opens from the perspective of our main character being interrogated by an FBI detective investigator woman, and her being like, well, this is how I got involved in this whole situation in the first place. And this book's twists and turns and the way that events accumulated and how everything went down was crazy. I was kind of obsessed with the pacing and girl boss slayage of it all. I mean, some moments of like weird American meritocracy, anti-China liberalism were kind of like, I don't know. But in general, I think like thematically, conceptually, and throughout the plot, it was really solid in what it was saying about like the designer handbag industry, and also like, you know, just like consumerism in general, and like scamming, and these women doing it successfully, unsuccessfully, getting caught for it, not getting caught for it, running a racket essentially, and doing it well until they get caught. So this was a great one. I had a great time listening to this. The next book that I read was the first edition to another comic, and that was The Many Deaths of Layla Starr by Ram V, which was also a very beautifully illustrated comic. It follows 2 timelines, or 2 perspectives, well, 2 timelines and perspectives, I guess, of this god of death, or goddess of death, being demoted and kicked out of like the heavens essentially, and this one orphan girl who's at like a college party and who dies, and how their lives and deaths intersect. And it's slay. I'm excited to read the rest of it, but again, I just read the first edition. It's like 1 comic, it's 25 pages. I don't have that much to say. It's all set in India, I think, and it's illustration and conception of the heavenly and earthly spheres and the spiritual realm, as well as that like bite of humor and spite and satire to it, was pretty smart and witty, and I enjoyed it. So yeah, I rated this 4 stars, I think, and I'm excited to read the rest of the series, hopefully. The next book that I read was Homocide and Halo Halo by Manansala. This book is the second in a series about a Filipino American young woman chef, well, baker, and she in this book has opened a bakery with her best friend and her best friend's girlfriend, and it's a bakery slash cafe essentially, and she makes like a Filipino American fusion baked goods. She gets roped into this pageant situation in her small town, and stuff starts going awry. I thought it was a sweet, cozy mystery, but it's just like corny, and the same criticisms I had of the first book in this series, which I think I mentioned in a previous wrap-up, I'll link it above if I can find it, are the same ones I have here. So I don't know, it's somewhat mediocre, but still but still fun for me to read. I rated it 3 stars, and I would recommend it if you're looking for a good cozy mystery with a lot of like food elements to it. The next book that I read was One's Company by Ashley Hutson, which I rated 4 stars. I really thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was a really interesting exploration of trauma and grief in a way that was fresh and new, and also like really deeply an exploration of loneliness that I haven't really seen before through this almost like melodramatic, but appropriately so, like approach and tone and lens, I guess. And anyway, so the premise is that our main character has won the lottery after having been the sole survivor of a brutal attack of a shop that she worked at, and her parents also died when she was young. She also had like a pretty poor family background as well, and her parents died when she was pretty young, so she was living with and basically like off the charity of her best friend's family a lot, and her best friend's family had a lot of their shit together, and her best friend's family was the one who owned the convenience store in question. And so her best friend's like parents and brother all died at this brutal massacre, but our main character was the lone survivor. But of course she experienced a lot of trauma from this, and also something really terrible happened during that event as well. But she wins the lottery, an untold amount of a lot of money, and she creates this little world for herself in which she finds like a more remote area and spends her money building this really isolated like house and set that entirely recreates this like 70s sitcom she's fucking obsessed with. And so for like 3 years she sees and speaks to literally no one, and she spends her days literally living out the lives of each character. She rotates the different characters each year of this sitcom, and it's her means of escapism, but other things start affecting her life there. And it was so interesting. This fucking bug, oh my god. It was so interesting and compelling and emotionally fraught, but also like funny, because inherently it's, you know, you have a ton of money and now you're going to live on the exact, like, the way that she builds the whole house and apartment to replicate the set in which she like makes these interior designers and people track down and collect the actual newspapers and magazines from the 1970s and the exact potted plants that are there and in those houses and rooms. And, you know, I just thought it was so sweet, but also like sad, the way that she finds and loses and builds these connections with obviously her fictional characters, which are escapist worlds and fantasies, but also with the people that she meets along the way and the trauma that she's experienced at the hands of and with like her best friend, who is one of the only people at the beginning of the book to the end who's been with her the whole time. So interesting to see play out, but it's just such a meaningful and interesting story that I've never read anything like it, but it's just so fucking good. I don't know. I really, really enjoyed it. I think it might even be like a 4.5 star book, maybe a 5 star. I'm not sure. I really loved it a lot. And the cover is so beautiful too. It's, oh, and the sitcom that she's like modeling her life and real life living her cosplay through is called Three's Company. So yeah. The next book that I read was Patricia Wants to Cuddle by Samantha Allen, which I rated 3.5 stars. This is a horror novel about a reality dating TV show and this Bigfoot-like creature that they encounter in the mountains, but that only happens towards like the second half of the book, and we alternate perspectives in the minds of these different women on the reality show. It was interesting, and it was short. It wasn't a waste of my time. I liked it. I don't really think there's that much to say about it. I think that like the very end of the book was a nice touch, and there's a certain like ooh about it, and it's a very queer book as well. It's also kind of like a satire and criticism of obviously reality dating show situation, but also about, I think, a couple of other things. I think I could have explored some themes deeper and better, but in other ways, I'm kind of happy with what it did. It probably could have been a bit better if it was longer, but also in other ways, it's good at the length that it is, but in some, I think it is pretty mediocre, and I get why a lot of people are giving it like mostly like 3 stars-ish. So yeah, the next book that I read in the month of August was Sedating Elaine by Dawn Winter. This book was another 5-star read, which is an unpopular opinion, which I understand. A lot of people did not like this book, and I get why. I think the ending was interesting, kind of unrealistic, but necessary, I would say, because it's so sad throughout all of it that we need something very uplifting and positive at the end. So it's like, you know, anyways, this book is about a woman named Frances, our main character, who is very mightily depressed and addicted to weed and alcohol. It's set in London. She is so hung up on her ex, Adrienne, who is this beautiful, glamorous woman who like left her like months ago. But Frances gets in this other relationship with this woman named Elaine, whom she fucking despises and hates, but for some reason just keeps fucking, and they end up moving in together. And Elaine pisses Frances off so bad. But Frances also works at this restaurant as like a dishwasher, and she owes a bunch of money to her drug dealer. And so Elaine comes from like money, like her parents are wealthy. And so part of the reason why Frances wants Elaine to come live with her and stay with her is so that she can help pay rent and like, you know, give her money. But things go awry, and Frances tries to sedate Elaine by drugging her and making her pass out so that Frances can like have a moment of peace, because apparently like Elaine has this really effusive personality and like takes up a lot of space like metaphysically. Frances always describes her as like very like physically large and strong and just like tall and like big, which is also a reflection of Frances's own perspective. I think there's an interesting dynamic between the narrator and Frances herself, where the narrator makes these comments and observations about Frances's nature and her own twisted perspective on things that Frances herself doesn't necessarily recognize or notice, while also we see Frances think and do these despicable things. It was like an emotional and compelling narrative following a detached and pitiful main character who is deeply unlikable, of course, but I love an unlikable female main character, as you know, and I love gay women and their antics and just the shit they get up to and the crazy dyke drama getting like involved here. Although I think all of the 3 women in here are all bisexual, I'm pretty sure. No real labels for sexualities are used in this book too, which is good, I think, and makes sense because all of these women are like in their 20s or whatever. I don't know. It was so good to me. Like, I liked this for the same reasons why I like the books like Eleanor Oliphant or Everyone in This Room is One Day Gonna Be Dead. It's not the same as that, or even like, you know, My Year of Rest and Relaxation. It's not any of those books. I think it's like them in some ways, but in ways that I think are a little bit more involved and less lacking in self-awareness, I guess, because even though Frances herself, she has more self-awareness than some other unlikable female main characters that I've read, but like the narrator has a lot of insight on Frances's like past traumas and what has informed Frances's behavior to like, you know, why she even acts like that, you know, and what informs the decisions she makes and why she's so hung up on her fucking ex and the crazy shit that she does, including sedating Elaine. So yeah, we follow her past and her present and like how she's dealing with shit. So yeah, I enjoyed this a lot, and I think it's a favorite of the year, and I rated it 5 stars. It might be more of a 4.5, but, you know, who knows? Who fucking knows? The next book that I read was another, like, on the cusp of, like, 4.5 and 5 stars, and that is Schmutz by Felicia Berliner. This is a pretty new release, and I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed the audiobook of this particularly as well, because the narrator is able to pronounce like the Yiddish words that when I read this with my eyes, my brain would like trip up on them mentally, you know, because obviously like I don't speak Yiddish, but Our main character in here is a 18-19-year-old girl who is Hasidic, lives in Brooklyn, has a pretty large family, but not as large as other people in her community, and she is addicted to porn. How is she addicted to porn, you could ask, considering that Hasidic Jews are not allowed to have access to the internet or computer, much less pornography. Well, it's because she is the only person from her community, much less woman, who goes to college and she's studying accounting. And she's also like a pretty major breadwinner for her family. And she's of marrying age and she's like having to go on her arranged dates essentially. And so she's seeing a therapist because she has this fear about like, how am I going to find the boy and what's the deal? But she also has to deal with this internet porn thing that she's keeping very secret and only discussing with her therapist a bit. But this book was so fascinating and funny, but also like, really desperately sad in some ways, because our main character feels so isolated while also being smothered in community and family, so buoyed by tradition and the roles that have been imposed on her, but also she has been sanctioned this offshoot of a path and, this ability to like go to college and have a computer for school and be the only person who like actually has internet access, despite, everyone else in her family and in her community having such a, like, being in such a closed community, right? Like when she goes to college, she ends up befriending this group of goths. It's really like sweet and endearing in some ways. Our main character's naivete versus like the reality she has of being addicted to porn and, her new experiences of viewing the world through the lens of her porn addiction and also like the way that it affects and shapes her life is so interesting to read about. The way that her faith is shaped and adjusted and how her customs and religious practices are like described are not in a way that feels written for a non-Jewish, non-Hasidic like reader. Like it's written in a way that feels genuine to a community that it's trying to represent as opposed to something that feels like disingenuous, I guess. I mean, I think it is very satirical and funny in many ways and a representation of just how community and family and expectations and the social roles that young women are just have to face regardless of faith. It's very interesting, like the social and religious and class issues that this book tackles without ever really facing them necessarily, like through the lens of a teenage girl really dealing with shit like really on her own and feeling like she's not really able to confide in her family or with anyone she's really close to. And her relationship with her siblings and the dynamics that she has, they were all so compelling and compulsively readable. I really enjoyed the writing of this, and I really enjoyed the humor and the love and the peek inside like community and customs that are typically just like not something, if you're not Hasidic, you're just not gonna know, This also has like quite a few like queer themes and elements on top of, the feminist ones, obviously. It was very good, and I would rate it like 4.5 stars, I think. And finally, the last book that I read, technically not really in August, was Sylvia Moreno Garcia's The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. But I'm not going to get into that right now because this video is already so fucking long. But I do want to tell you that I am halfway through The Beautiful Ones by Sylvia Moreno Garcia as well, because I'm on that reading kick and streak of wanting to read her books for some reason because I finished the Dr. Moreau book. And I'm like more than halfway through this and I'm really enjoying this book right now. I'll keep you updated, but just letting you know, to give you my 70% of the way through review, this book is a love triangle story about landed aristocracy and class ascension of these random straight French people that has pulled on my heartstrings in a way that I could not have predicted. Wow. Love. Okay, that is finally the end of my August wrap up. I would say that I had a really, really good reading month. Like with the number of books I read, the number of 4 and 5 star ratings I gave, the streaks and eras I went on, even if I did fail my like set TBR. I got through a lot of my physical TBR and I'm really happy about that. Let me know in the comments down below if you have read any of these and your thoughts on them, if you agree or disagree with any of my reviews or opinions, or if any of these books sound interesting to you. And I have a Patreon if you want to tip me and help support my channel. Like this video and subscribe to me if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye!